At 9:15 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, positioned roughly 600 miles behind his main striking force, waiting for news that he believed would finally confirm everything he had warned Japan's leadership about for more than a decade. 6 months earlier, his carrier aircraft had shattered Pearl Harbor. 6 straight months of uninterrupted Japanese victories had followed, unfolding almost exactly as he had predicted. Now, his immense fleet was closing in on Midway Atoll, poised to deliver what was meant to be the decisive blow, one that would force the United States to seek peace on Japan's terms. Yamamoto had committed 4 heavy aircraft carriers to the attack on the tiny island, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had unleashed destruction at Pearl Harbor. Alongside them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. He commanded the most experienced naval aviators on Earth, pilots who had trained for years and accumulated combat experience across China and the Pacific. On paper, he held every possible advantage. Yet Yamamoto also possessed something none of his fellow admirals did. He had lived in America. He had walked its streets, studied at its universities, and played poker with its naval officers. He understood the American character in a way no other senior Japanese military leader could claim, and that understanding filled him with dread. Yamamoto knew what his colleagues refused to accept. Americans were not soft. They were not weak. They were not the decadent materialists portrayed in Japanese propaganda. They were something far more dangerous, an industrial giant with seemingly limitless resources and a fierce, stubborn determination that Japan had provoked with bombs and torpedoes. Within the next 6 hours, everything Yamamoto feared began to unfold, culminating in the most catastrophic naval defeat in Japanese history. What happened at Midway, and what followed during the 3 years of brutal warfare across the Pacific, stands as one of the greatest failures of strategic perception ever recorded. Japanese leaders convinced themselves they understood America. They were disastrously wrong. The roots of that failure stretched back decades before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The core problem Japan faced in 1941 was not military strength or weakness. It was perception. Japanese military and civilian leaders had constructed an image of the United States that bore little resemblance to reality, and that false image led them to make decisions that ensured their own destruction. The dominant belief within Japanese leadership circles was that Americans were spiritually weak. This was not merely propaganda meant for public morale. Senior generals and admirals truly believed it. They were convinced that a society founded on individual rights, democratic ideals, and material comfort could never equal the fighting spirit of warriors raised within the traditions of Bushido. Japanese officers openly ridiculed American soldiers, dismissing them as products of a soft culture. Young men accustomed to automobiles, convenience, and comfort, incapable of enduring the hardships of true combat. The Japanese military believed absolutely in its own people's willingness to sacrifice everything for the nation, and it held deep contempt for what it saw as the softness of Western democracies, where loyalty and patriotism were moderated by concern for personal rights and individual well-being. In Japanese military thinking, this concern for the individual represented a fatal flaw. A soldier who valued his own survival, they believed, could never fight with the total devotion that victory demanded. This disdain ran deep. Japanese planners assumed that Americans, when confronted with a sudden and devastating defeat, would simply lose the will to continue fighting. They believed a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, people focused on comfort and economic prosperity, would choose negotiation over enduring a long, bloody war. Again and again in Tokyo's war councils, the same phrase was repeated. Americans lacked the stomach for a prolonged conflict. One hard, shocking blow, they believed, would bring the United States to the negotiating table. Japanese intelligence reports seemed to confirm these assumptions. Officers stationed in Washington and other American cities sent back observations describing labor strikes, political divisions, isolationist movements, and what they interpreted as a general softness in American society. They noted that the U.S. military was relatively small and poorly equipped compared to the massive armies then dominating Europe and Asia. They calculated that American industrial power, while formidable, would require years to fully convert to wartime production, years Japan intended to use to establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Many Japanese also viewed America as a violent and morally corrupt nation, with gangsters roaming cities like Chicago and New York. American motion pictures, widely shown in Japanese theaters, reinforce images of a chaotic and undisciplined society. Japanese intellectuals often look down on American culture as shallow and materialistic, lacking the spiritual depth and long historical traditions they believed defined Japanese civilization. But there was one Japanese naval officer who understood just how dangerously wrong these assumptions were. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and had spent 4 years living inside the very country his colleagues so badly misunderstood. Yamamoto was born on April 4, 1884, in the small city of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture. His father was 56 years old at the time of his birth, and following Japanese custom, the boy was named Isoroku, literally meaning 56. He was born into a samurai family that had fallen on hard times after the Meiji Restoration, a family that had fought on the losing side during the civil wars that unified Japan. The legacy of defeat and the loss of status shaped Yamamoto's early life, instilling in him both strict discipline and a relentless determination to prove his worth through service to the nation. Despite frequent illnesses during childhood, young Isoroku displayed exceptional intelligence and resolve. He excelled in mathematics and literature and developed the stubborn willpower that would define his entire career. He passed the demanding entrance examinations for the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and graduated in 1904 near the top of his class, just in time to serve in the war against Russia. In May of 1905, during the Battle of the Tsushima Strait, Ensign Yamamoto served aboard the cruiser Nishin. The battle was a stunning Japanese victory, the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in a major naval engagement. For Yamamoto personally, however, the triumph came at a terrible cost. A Russian shell struck his ship and knocked him unconscious. When he regained awareness, he discovered that 2 fingers on his left hand were gone and that he had suffered severe wounds to his thigh. The injury would mark him for life, earning him a darkly humorous nickname among the geisha who entertained him, the 80-cent Admiral, a reference to the discounted price of a manicure for a man with only 8 fingers. Yamamoto accepted the nickname without offense. He wore his wounds with pride. To him, they were symbols of sacrifice for the emperor and the nation, visible proof that he had paid in blood for Japan's honor. After the war, Yamamoto advanced steadily through the naval ranks. His superiors quickly recognized him as exceptionally intelligent, unusually open-minded, and fluent in English, a rare combination within the Imperial Japanese Navy. He attended the Naval Staff College, where he distinguished himself through sharp strategic thinking and an ability to see beyond conventional doctrine. In 1916, he was formally adopted into the Yamamoto family, a common Japanese practice intended to preserve respected family lines, and he took their name. By 1919, Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto had drawn enough attention that the Navy selected him for an extraordinary assignment. He was sent to the United States to study at Harvard University. Yamamoto arrived in America at the age of 35. He was small even by Japanese standards, standing just 5 feet 3 inches tall, but his broad shoulders and intense, penetrating gaze made him difficult to overlook. He enrolled as a special student at Harvard, focusing his studies on the American oil industry. This was no abstract academic interest. Oil was the lifeblood of modern naval warfare. Control of petroleum meant control of fleets, aircraft, and the ability to project power across oceans. Yamamoto understood this with absolute clarity. Yet his most important education took place far beyond the lecture halls. Japanese officers sent abroad were expected to return with detailed intelligence about their host nations, and Yamamoto embraced that responsibility with zeal. During his 2 years at Harvard, he traveled widely across the United States. He hitchhiked through New England, crossed the vast Great Plains, visited the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, and explored the industrial heartlands of the Midwest. He did not confine himself to official visits or polite observation. He stayed in American homes, ate in ordinary restaurants, and spoke directly with workers about their lives, their values, and their expectations of the future. What Yamamoto witnessed shocked him. He walked through the automobile factories of Detroit and watched American workers assemble cars with a speed and precision that left him astonished. At Ford's Highland Park plant, a completed automobile rolled off the assembly line every 93 minutes. The scale of production defied anything Yamamoto had previously imagined. He toured steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary, where furnaces burned without pause, producing more metal in a single week than Japan could manufacture in an entire year. In Texas, he observed oil refineries that processed more petroleum in a month than Japan consumed annually. The figures were overwhelming. By every conceivable measure, America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. American factories could produce 10 times as many automobiles, 20 times as much steel, and consume more oil in a single day than Japan could secure in months. Yamamoto, trained to think in strategic terms, immediately grasped what this meant for any future conflict. The nation capable of producing more weapons, more ships, more aircraft, and more supplies would inevitably prevail in a long war. Industrial output was not merely an economic statistic. It was destiny on the battlefield. Equally important to Yamamoto was what he learned about the American people themselves. He quickly realized that they bore little resemblance to the weak, decadent caricatures promoted by Japanese propaganda. Americans struck him as practical, inventive, and fiercely competitive, traits that remind him of Japan's own warrior traditions. They complained endlessly about their government, argued openly among themselves, and appeared obsessed with individual rights. Yet they also worked relentlessly, took immense pride in what they built, and showed remarkable resilience when confronted with hardship. It was during this period that Yamamoto discovered poker. He became intensely devoted to the game, playing late into the night with anyone willing to sit across from him. Fellow students at Harvard remembered him as a near-fanatical poker player, winning hand after hand through a blend of mathematical precision, psychological insight, and sheer nerve. He used his winnings to finance his travels, hitchhiking from state to state during academic breaks. Poker taught him how to read opponents, calculate odds, manage risk, and recognize the American tendency bluff, to raise the stakes, and to refuse to fold even when the situation appeared hopeless. Years later, historians would note that Yamamoto's strategy at Pearl Harbor reflected these lessons. He was wagering everything on a single bold play, attempting to knock the strongest opponent out of the game early, just as he might have done at the card table. When Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1921, he carried knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knew that America possessed an industrial base Japan could never hope to match. He understood that the American character, far from being weak, combined pride with an almost frightening determination. And he recognized that any war with the United States would be a gamble of enormous risk, one Japan could not afford to lose. In 1926, Yamamoto returned to America as a naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington. For 2 more years, he immersed himself once again in American society. He attended diplomatic receptions, met frequently with American naval officers, and continued refining his poker skills. To some colleagues, he described the United States Navy as a club of golfers and bridge players, implying a certain lack of sharpness among individual American officers. This scorn, however, was largely confined to casual settings and private conversations. In matters of grand strategy, Yamamoto never underestimated what America was capable of achieving once fully mobilized. During the second assignment, Yamamoto developed what he called a healthy respect for American industrial power. He had seen how American factories had shifted during the Great War, rapidly converting from consumer production to weapons manufacturing. He had studied how American shipyards could construct vessels faster than any other navy on Earth. He understood that the same assembly line techniques that produce millions of automobiles could just as easily produce thousands of aircraft, tanks, and warships if the nation committed itself to war. He also grasped an essential truth about American psychology that many of his peers completely missed. Americans did not seek conflict. They preferred commerce, entertainment, and personal comfort. But once attacked, once their national pride was wounded, they fought with ferocity that few nations could equal. The American Civil War had demonstrated a willingness to endure staggering casualties in defense of principle, and Yamamoto had studied that conflict carefully. He understood its lessons. Throughout the 1930s, as Japan moved steadily toward ever more aggressive policies. In Asia, Yamamoto became one of the very few senior officers willing to speak openly about the dangers of a war with the United States. He opposed the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. He opposed the expansion of the conflict into a full-scale war with China in 1937. And he vehemently opposed the tripartite pact that bound Japan to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in 1940. His stance earned him powerful enemies. Japanese ultranationalists branded Yamamoto a traitor, claiming he'd been corrupted by his years in America. Death threats arrived almost daily. In February 1936, junior officers within the Navy ministry even approached him about joining a planned coup. Yamamoto dismissed them without raising his voice, ordering them back to their desks as if nothing unusual had occurred. By 1938, the danger had escalated to such a degree that Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai decided Yamamoto's only real protection was distance. He sent him back to sea, appointing him commander of the combined fleet. In many ways, it was a promotion into exile, an effort to remove him from Tokyo before an assassin could succeed. Yet, Yamamoto's warnings only grew more urgent. When Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono asked him directly about Japan's prospects in a war against the United States, Yamamoto answered with chilling clarity. "If we are ordered fight," he said, "I can promise that we will put up a fierce struggle for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence in what will happen if the war lasts 2 or 3 years. I sincerely hope you will make every effort to avoid war with America." 6 months. In Yamamoto's calculations, Japan had precisely 6 months to secure victory or face unavoidable defeat. After that point, American industrial output would overwhelm anything Japan could place on the battlefield. Factories that produce refrigerators and washing machines would be retooled to manufacture bombs and ammunition. Shipyards that built merchant vessels would launch aircraft carriers. Young men from farms, towns, and cities across an entire continent will be transformed into soldiers and sailors. America's full strength would be unleashed. Yamamoto repeated similar warnings to other officials. In September 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, he told one audience that for a time Japan would have everything its own way, spreading outward in all directions like an octopus extending its tentacles, but that this advantage would last no more than a year and a half. He compared Japan's strategic position to a man who had seized a tiger by the tail, unable to let go, yet doomed if he continued to hold on. Still, his words went unheeded. Army generals and most of his fellow admirals dismissed his concerns outright. They believed unwaveringly in the superiority of Japanese spirit over American material strength. They convinced themselves that a single decisive battle would shatter American resolve, just as Tsushima had broken Russia in 1905. They could not imagine that a nation they viewed as soft, divided, and decadent would endure a long, savage war fought across thousands of miles of open ocean. Their confidence rested on deeply flawed racial and cultural assumptions that blinded them to the realities Yamamoto had witnessed firsthand. The decision for war was made without him. In October 1941, General Hideki Tojo became prime minister. Tojo, a longtime rival of Yamamoto's, was a hardline expansionist who had played a central role in Japan's seizure of Manchuria. Under his leadership, Japan committed itself to war against the United States and Britain. Yamamoto was ordered to devise a plan to neutralize American naval power in the Pacific. Despite his opposition to the war itself, he was a naval officer bound by duty. If Japan was to fight America, he would give his country its best possible chance. That meant striking first, striking decisively, and hoping that a devastating opening blow could achieve what prolonged conventional warfare never could. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's carriers launched 353 planes in two massive waves that crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 8 American battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 2,400 Americans were killed. It was among the most successful surprise attacks in military history. Yet, Yamamoto felt no triumph. While his staff officers celebrated, he spent the following day sunk in visible gloom. He later wrote that a military man could scarcely take pride in striking a sleeping enemy. It was not a matter of glory, he believed, but one of shame, particularly for the side that had been struck. The American aircraft carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor and escaped destruction. The vital oil storage tanks and repair facilities remained untouched. Most important of all, Yamamoto grasped what his jubilant subordinates did not. The attack had unified the United States completely. The nation he had studied so carefully was now fully committed to war. In the weeks that followed, intelligence reports confirmed his fears. Congress declared war with only a single dissenting vote. Recruiting stations overflowed with young men volunteering for service. Factories converted to wartime production at a speed that stunned Japanese planners. The very traits Japan's leaders had dismissed, America's industrial scale, democratic cohesion in crisis, and unyielding determination, were now turning relentlessly against the empire. Yamamoto later confided bitterly that many people felt relieved, even grateful to him, because no air raids had yet struck Japan. They were mistaken. The enemy's absence, he said, was no credit to Admiral Yamamoto, but to the enemy's own decisions. If Americans truly resolved to attack, there would be no way to defend a city like Tokyo. Even in moments that looked like victory, Yamamoto understood how exposed Japan really was. For exactly 6 months, events unfolded just as he had predicted. Japanese forces surged across the Pacific, capturing Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Japan's offensive perimeter expanded across millions of square miles of ocean and land. Soldiers and sailors believed themselves unstoppable. British, Dutch, and American forces collapsed before them. To many, it seemed as though nothing could halt the advance. But Yamamoto knew time was running out. He needed to destroy the American aircraft carriers before U.S. industrial output tipped the balance irreversibly. He devised a plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive engagement at Midway Atoll, a tiny outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The plan was intricate, perhaps fatally so, splitting Japanese forces into several widely separated groups scattered across enormous distances. It was a complicated plan, arguably too complicated, but Yamamoto believed he had no alternative. He had to destroy America's carrier strength, while Japan still held the advantage. What Yamamoto did not know was that American codebreakers had already penetrated Japanese naval communications. At Station HYPO in Hawaii, a team led by Commander Joseph Rockefeller had broken enough of Japan's naval code to determine that a major operation was being planned against a target identified only as F. When American intelligence arranged for Midway to transmit a fake message reporting a shortage of fresh water, Japanese communications obligingly confirmed that AF was indeed suffering from a lack of fresh water. The Americans now knew precisely where and roughly when Yamamoto intended to strike. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Midway Island. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the 4 Japanese carriers from his flagship Akagi, believed he had achieved complete tactical surprise. His aircraft pounded the American base, and his flight crews began preparing for a second strike. But just beyond the horizon, 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned them based on the intelligence breakthrough, turning what Nagumo believed was Japanese surprise into an American strategic ambush. The battle opened disastrously for the Americans. Torpedo bombers from all three carriers attacked the Japanese fleet and were annihilated. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 of its aircraft. Only a single pilot survived. Of the 41 torpedo planes launched that morning, only 6 returned, and not a single torpedo struck its target. Yet their sacrifice proved decisive. By drawing Japanese fighter aircraft down to low altitude and forcing constant evasive maneuvers, they disrupted Japanese carrier operations at a critical moment. Minutes later, American dive bombers arrived overhead. They found the Japanese carriers exposed, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise plunged out of sun. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. Bombs tore through their flight decks and detonated in hangars packed with fueled and armed aircraft. Chain reactions of explosions transformed the ships into floating crematoriums. Later that afternoon, aircraft from the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu managed to strike Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes. But before sunset, American planes located Hiryu and reduced her to a burning wreck, no different from her sisters. In a single day, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and the bulk of its most experienced naval aviators. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the core of Japan's striking power. The pilots who perished with them were men who had trained for years and accumulated thousands of hours of combat flying. They could not be replaced. Japan's training system simply could not produce aviators of comparable skill fast enough to affect the outcome of the war. It took years to create a naval pilot capable of executing the precise attacks Japanese doctrine demanded. It took only minutes to kill one. Yamamoto received the news aboard Yamato with what witnesses described as stoic composure. His chief of staff later wrote that Yamamoto felt bitter, that he felt like swearing. Inside, however, Yamamoto must have felt something closer to anguish. Everything he had predicted was now unfolding exactly as he had feared. The 6 months were over. From that moment on, American industrial capacity would grind Japan down. In a war of attrition, the empire could not hope to win. In Tokyo and throughout Japan, the disaster at Midway was concealed from the public. Wounded survivors were isolated in hospitals, forbidden to speak of what had happened. Official announcements declared a great victory. But within the military, those who understood the truth began to grasp that Yamamoto had been right all along. The war they had entered with such confidence had become a war they could not win. The 18 months following Midway transformed the Pacific conflict into precisely the grinding struggle Yamamoto had warned against. In August 1942, American forces launched their first major offensive, landing Marines on a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain called Guadalcanal, where the Japanese had been constructing an airfield. The Americans intended to seize it. Japanese soldiers who had been told that Americans were weak discovered the truth in brutal, close-quarters combat. Marines and Army troops fought with ferocity that stunned Japanese veterans. The Americans did not collapse. They did not ask for peace. They kept advancing. Night after night, Japanese troops launched banzai charges against American positions. Night after night, they were mowed down by machine gun fire and artillery. There was no sign of the spiritual weakness Japanese propaganda had promised. On Guadalcanal, Japanese forces encountered another enemy that revealed the true nature of American power: logistics. While Japanese soldiers starved, surviving on meager rations and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle, American troops received steady flows of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. The contrast was devastating. Japan's industrial capacity amounted to roughly 10% of America's, and that imbalance appeared in every aspect of the campaign. Japanese forces could not rely on slow transport ships to supply their troops because American aircraft operating from Henderson Field, the captured airstrip on Guadalcanal, would destroy them in daylight. Instead, they depended on fast destroyer runs, known among sailors as the Tokyo Express, which could carry only limited supplies. The result was systematic starvation. By December 1942, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were losing approximately 50 men per day to hunger, disease, and American attacks. The plan formulated in Tokyo that a single overwhelming offensive would recapture the airfield proved impossible when soldiers were too weakened by starvation to carry their weapons. Vice Admiral Reizo Tanaka, who commanded the destroyer supply runs, later wrote that there was no doubt Japan's fate had been sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal. An island Japanese planners had dismissed as insignificant became the graveyard of imperial ambition. Japan finally evacuated its remaining troops in February 1943, conceding the island after 6 months of brutal fighting. It marked the first major retreat by Japanese forces in the Pacific War. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the reality Yamamoto had tried to impress upon his colleagues became impossible to ignore. American shipyards launched new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. In 1943 alone, America commissioned 50 new aircraft carriers of various classes. Japan could not hope to match that level of output, even if its shipyards operated without pause. American factories turn out aircraft by the tens of thousands. American training programs produce pilots in enormous numbers who, though initially less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, grew steadily more skilled as the war progressed. The assembly lines Yamamoto had once observed in Detroit were now manufacturing the tools of Japan's destruction. The disparity in pilot training became especially severe. Japan had entered the war with perhaps the finest trained naval aviators in the world. But as those elite pilots were killed in combat, Japan lacked the capacity to replace them. Training courses were shortened. Fuel for practice flights became scarce. New pilots were sent into battle with hundreds of fewer flight hours than the men they replaced. In contrast, American training programs expanded dramatically, producing aviators who often had more flight time than many Japanese veterans. By 1944, the average American naval pilot was better trained than the average Japanese pilot, a complete reversal from the opening days of the war. By April 1943, Yamamoto was headquartered at Rabaul in the South Pacific, directing increasingly desperate defensive operations against the advancing Americans. He had aged noticeably since Pearl Harbor. The constant strain of watching predictions come true, of knowing that his country was fighting a war it could not win, pressed heavily on him. In a letter written around this time, he confided to a friend that he felt his life would be finished within the next 100 days. On April 13th, Yamamoto's staff finalized plans for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The trip was meant to bolster the morale of Japanese troops who had been fighting and dying in battles that were becoming ever more hopeless. Yamamoto was warned that the journey was dangerous. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Mamura, commander of ground forces at Rabaul, had narrowly escaped being shot down over Bougainville just 2 months earlier. But Yamamoto's chief of staff argued that the visit was essential. Having already announced his plans, Yamamoto stated that even if the route was dangerous, he could not turn back. The itinerary was transmitted to the relevant units using the Japanese Naval Code, code the Americans were still reading. On April 14th, code breakers at station HYPO intercepted and decrypted the message. It included precise details of Yamamoto's travel schedule, down to the exact time he would land at an airfield near Bougainville Island. Among those serving at HYPO was a young officer named John Paul Stevens, who would later become a justice of the United States Supreme Court. When the intelligence reached Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, its significance was immediately understood. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack could be killed. On April 17th, Nimitz authorized a mission. Yamamoto was not merely a military target. He was a symbol of the attack that had drawn America into the war. Eliminating him would serve as revenge for December 7th, a severe blow to Japanese morale, and the removal of Japan's most capable naval strategist. The operation was given the code name Vengeance. On the morning of April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters lifted off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The P-38 was the only American fighter with the range necessary to reach Bougainville and return. The pilots followed a long, circuitous route over open water, maintaining strict radio silence and flying at altitudes below 50 feet to avoid Japanese radar. The flight covered more than 400 miles, navigated by dead reckoning and precisely timed compass headings. Major John Mitchell calculated the intercept time at 9:35 a.m., 10 minutes before Yamamoto was scheduled to land. That morning, Yamamoto departed Rabaul wearing his green operational uniform rather than the formal white uniform typically used for inspection tours. Some who saw him remarked that he appeared resigned, as though he sensed what lay ahead. On the flight to Bougainville, his Mitsubishi G4M bomber flew in formation with a second aircraft carrying his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, accompanied by escort fighters from the Japanese Naval Air Service. Yamamoto's legendary punctuality made the ambush possible. The Americans were counting on him, arriving exactly on time. At 9:34 a.m., the American P-38s reached the intercept point along the western edge of Bougainville. Just as Yamamoto's aircraft descended toward the coastline, the Japanese formation appeared precisely on schedule. The American pilots dropped their external fuel tanks and climbed to attack. There were two bombers instead of the one they had expected, and the pilots did not know which carried Yamamoto. Both would have to be destroyed. The air battle was short and violent. Lieutenant Rex Barber, the attack flight, maneuvered behind Yamamoto's bomber and raked it with machine gun and cannon fire. Trailing smoke and flame, the aircraft plunged into the jungle below. The second bomber, carrying Agaki, was also hit and crashed into the sea. Agaki and 3 others survived, though one American P-38 was lost as the remaining fighters turned for home. Captain Thomas Lanford broke radio silence to announce that the son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House, a reference to a widely misunderstood statement attributed to Yamamoto about the impossibility of defeating America in a prolonged war. Japanese search parties located Yamamoto's body the following day. He was still strapped into his seat, thrown clear of the wreckage, and still clutching his ceremonial sword. An autopsy revealed that he had been killed by gunfire, likely dying before the aircraft struck the ground. The man who had warned Japan against war, who had understood America more clearly than any other Japanese leader, was dead at the age of 59. The Japanese government concealed his death from the public for more than a month. When the announcement was finally made on May 21st, it stunned the nation. Yamamoto was promoted posthumously to Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and honored with a state funeral. His ashes were returned to Japan aboard the battleship Musashi. Nazi Germany awarded him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, making him the first foreign recipient of the decoration. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance was both a tactical triumph and a security nightmare. The mission risked revealing that U.S. intelligence could read Japanese communications, and officials feared that careless discussion might alert the enemy. Coverage in Time magazine came dangerously close to exposing the code-breaking secret and caused serious concern in Washington. Major Mitchell's nomination for Medal of Honor was quietly downgraded to the Navy Cross to avoid drawing further attention to the operation. But the deeper meaning of Yamamoto's death extended far beyond intelligence secrecy or battlefield tactics. It marked the final collapse of Japanese assumptions about American character. The very nation Japanese leaders had dismissed as soft and unwilling to fight had reached across thousands of miles of ocean to eliminate Japan's most respected admiral in a precisely timed ambush. The message was unmistakable. The Americans were not going to negotiate. They were not going to give up. They were going to fight until Japan was defeated. The war continued for 2 more years after Yamamoto's death. American forces pushed steadily across the Pacific in an island-hopping campaign that carried them ever closer to the Japanese home islands. Each major battle, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, confirmed the same truths Yamamoto had tried to convey before the war ever began. American industrial capacity was overwhelming. American soldiers and Marines fought with a determination that equaled anything Japan could muster, and the United States would accept nothing short of unconditional surrender. Japanese soldiers who faced American forces in these final campaigns discovered just how wrong their pre-war beliefs had been. The Americans they encountered were not soft products of a decadent consumer society. They were tough, adaptable, and relentlessly committed to victory. The very traits Japanese propaganda had mocked, American individualism, innovation, and material abundance, proved to be enormous military advantages. American equipment arrived in quantities that stunned Japanese troops. Where Japanese units struggled to keep a handful of tanks or artillery pieces operational, American forces deployed them by the hundreds. Where Japanese pilots flew increasingly outdated aircraft with dwindling fuel supplies, American pilots flew the latest models with seemingly limitless ammunition and replacements. The industrial gap Yamamoto had observed decades earlier in Detroit's automobile plants now appeared on every Pacific battlefield as a vast disparity in firepower, logistics, and manpower. Japanese prisoners of war were often deeply shocked by their treatment. They had been taught that Americans would torture or kill captives. Instead, they received medical care, adequate food, and tolerable conditions. For some, this unexpected humanity was more unsettling than cruelty would have been. It shattered everything they had been told about their enemy. By August 1945, American bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ashes. 29 superfortresses, machines that embodied the peak of American industrial and technological power, flew from bases in the Marianas to drop incendiaries on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities. On the night of March 9th and 10th, the firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. Japan's wooden cities burned with terrifying speed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th revealed American industrial and technological power in the most horrifying form imaginable. These weapons represented not only scientific achievement, but the ability to mobilize billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of workers for a single, secret undertaking. No other nation on Earth could have achieved what the United States accomplished with the Manhattan Project. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, citing the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb. The war Yamamoto had warned against for more than a decade ended in devastation beyond anything even he had imagined. In the aftermath, Japanese historians and military analysts re-examined the pre-war assumptions that had led the nation to catastrophe. Again and again, they found the same pattern: wishful thinking, cultural arrogance, and deliberate blindness to evidence that contradicted comfortable beliefs. Japanese leaders had constructed an image of America that served ideology rather than reality. They ignored warnings from the few officers, like Yamamoto, who truly understood the enemy. The tragedy of Isoroku Yamamoto was that he understood everything and could change nothing. He knew Japan could not defeat the United States in a prolonged war. He knew the attack on Pearl Harbor would unite Americans instead of breaking their will. He knew that 6 months of victories would be followed by years of defeat. Yet he was a naval officer bound by duty and honor. When his country chose war, he did everything in his power to give Japan a chance, even though he knew that chance was almost certainly doomed. In the decades since World War II, Yamamoto has remained a complex figure in both Japanese and American memory. In Japan, he is honored as a patriot who served his nation with intelligence and dedication. In the United States, he is remembered chiefly as the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man responsible for an attack that killed thousands. Both interpretations miss something essential about who Yamamoto was and what he tried to warn his country about. Yamamoto spent 4 years in America. He played poker with Americans, traveled their highways, studied their industries, and came to understand their character. When he returned to Japan, he spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he had learned. Americans were not weak. Their industrial power was beyond anything Japan could match. A war with the United States would be a gamble Japan would almost certainly lose. No one listened. Generals and admirals who had never set foot in America believed they understood the country better than a man who had lived there. They believed in Japanese spiritual superiority over American material strength. They believed a single stunning blow would break American will. They believed they could win. They were wrong about everything. And Japan paid for that arrogance with millions of lives, burned cities, and total defeat. The question of what Japanese leaders believed about America during World War II ultimately becomes a lesson about the danger of underestimating an enemy. They convinced themselves Americans were too soft, too divided, and too materialistic to fight a real war. They dismissed evidence of American industrial capacity because it did not fit their narrative. They ignored warnings from those who actually knew the United States because those warnings were inconvenient. The one man who truly understood America, who had walked its streets, studied its people, and grasped the scale of its power, could do nothing but watch as his country stumbled into a war it could not win. Isoroku Yamamoto died in the skies over Bougainville, shot down by American fighters on a mission of revenge. But in a deeper sense, he had been right all along. He had predicted 6 months of victory, followed by defeat. The Battle of Midway came almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Everything that followed was Japan learning, slowly and painfully, what Yamamoto had tried to warn them about from the very beginning. America was now fully committed to the war, and Japan paid dearly for underestimating its resolve. There is one final irony in this story that deserves attention. The very quality Japanese leaders most despise in American society, its individualism, its materialism, and its seemingly chaotic democracy, turned out to be the foundations of American strength. Individual initiative fueled innovation on factory floors and on battlefields. Material abundance became overwhelming firepower and unmatched logistics. Democratic debate, rather than weakening national resolve, produced a unity of purpose that authoritarian systems could never replicate. Yamamoto understood this because he had experienced American society from the inside. He had seen Americans compete fiercely as individuals while still cooperating toward shared goals. He had watched factory workers take pride in their output and suggest improvements that management willingly adopted. He had observed the uniquely American blend of criticism and loyalty, the ability to question government decisions while still rallying decisively to defend the nation when threatened. Japan's system, built on rigid hierarchy, obedience, and spiritual ideology, could not adapt quickly enough to compete with American pragmatism. When something failed in America, people changed it. When something failed in Japan, blame often fell on those who dared to point out the problem. Yamamoto's warnings were ignored not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. A system that valued loyalty over accuracy could not process information that challenged its assumptions. The lessons of Japanese perceptions during World War II extend far beyond that single conflict. They reveal universal dangers faced by nations and organizations in every era. The danger of believing one's own propaganda, the danger of assuming that different means inferior, the danger of dismissing expert warnings because they contradict what leaders want to hear, and the danger of underestimating an opponent based on cultural stereotypes rather than careful analysis. Yamamoto committed none of these mistakes. He gathered information firsthand. He assessed American strengths honestly. He delivered accurate warnings to his superiors. He did everything a capable intelligence officer and strategic thinker was supposed to do, and it made no difference at all. Those above him had already decided what they wanted to believe, and no amount of evidence could change their minds. In the end, what Japanese leaders believed about America during World War II was a fantasy that cost them everything. They imagined an enemy that did not exist, a nation of soft, divided people who would collapse under pressure. The real America, the America Yamamoto knew, was something else entirely. It was a nation of factories and farms, of workers and soldiers, of stubborn pride and seemingly limitless resources. It was As Yamamoto tried to warn anyone who would listen, an opponent Japan could never defeat. If you found this exploration of history as compelling as we did, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these forgotten histories. Every story matters. Every perspective deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. So leave a comment below telling us which aspect of World War II you would like us to explore next. From veterans to lifelong history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.